I was raised in HopeTown on Polvo. It's a corporate town run by Ron Hope, the CEO of HopeTech Manufacturing. He likes to sell it as a utopia, a place where workers are provided everything they need for a happy life. But that's a lie.
There is a story we tell ourselves about how civilization grows, that it begins with people, that communities form first, and that structures of governance arise afterward to serve them. A settlement appears. People arrive in sufficient numbers that some form of order becomes necessary. Rules are written, enforced, revised. Someone is elected or appointed to make the decisions that affect everyone. The sequence feels almost biological, the natural progression of human presence from arrival to organization, from organization to authority, from authority to something that eventually gets called a society. We believe it because it flatters us. It suggests that power answers to people, that governance emerges from consent, that the city exists for the citizen and not the other way around. But that story has never been entirely true, and out in the Valo system, on a temperate rock world called Polvo, its continent edges swept by persistent wind, its hinterlands shifting between rocky desert and rough hills, and the distant gray of ocean, there is a settlement that makes the gap between the story and reality impossible to ignore. HopeTown does not pretend to be anything it is not. It does not wrap its arrangements in the language of civic participation or dress its hierarchy in the costume of democratic process. The company built the town. The company owns the buildings the workers live in. The company runs security, administers the rules, controls the local economy, determines in ways both explicit and invisible who belongs here and under what terms. There is no government in HopeTown in the traditional sense, no council with a mandate from the residents, no magistrate appointed by an independent authority, no formal mechanism by which the people who live here can meaningfully shape the conditions under which they live. There is HopeTech, and in the space between those two things, between what a government is supposed to be and what a company actually is, something revealing is happening, something that has been building quietly out here on a planet most people in the settled systems could not locate without checking a star map. The question is not whether this arrangement is unusual. It is not. Not really. Not in a galaxy where the distinction between corporate interest and civic authority has been blurring at the edges for generations. The question is whether the people living inside it can still feel the seams, whether they experience their daily lives as citizens or as employees, whether those two things, out here on the frontier, still mean anything different at all. That is the real question at the heart of HopeTown. Begin with the planet itself, because in a place like this, the environment is not incidental background. It is an argument. Polvo sits within the Valo system in a region of space that does not feature prominently in the grand narratives of the settled systems. It is not Jemison with its gleaming capital, not Voli Alpha with its intoxicant-soaked skyline, not any of the worlds that have accumulated enough history or enough commerce to become characters in the larger story of human expansion. Polvo is marginal, not by accident, but by the quiet arithmetic of geography and economics that determines which worlds get incorporated into the mainstream of civilization, and which are left at its edges to find their own reasons for existing. What the planet looks like when you set down at HopeTown's landing pad is something close to patience. The settlement sits on a stretch of rocky continental ground, arid, low, the kind of terrain that resists anything that tries to grow in it without reason. The colors run to tan and amber and ochre, broken occasionally by mineral outcroppings that catch the light differently, hinting at the subsurface wealth sitting in quiet abundance beneath the rock. Polvo has oceans, wide stretches of water visible from orbit, breaking the continent clusters apart, and a temperate atmosphere you can breathe without assistance. But in the vicinity of the shipyard, on the particular patch of ground HopeTech chose to build on, it is the wind and the rock that define the character of the place. The wind is persistent here. It does not howl or rage. It simply persists. It is the kind of wind that, over years, shapes the way people hold themselves. A slight forward lean, a habit of narrowing the eyes, a patience that looks like resignation until you understand it as something more calibrated. Into this environment, HopeTech arrived not as a colonial authority, not as a government expedition, but as a company with a specific and practical ambition: to manufacture starships in a location that offered both the material inputs and the operational freedom to do so entirely on their own terms. The demand for starships in the settled systems is not a niche market. It is the structural fact of human civilization at interstellar scale. Every faction, every merchant house, every independent operator needs vessels capable of crossing the distances between stars. The United Colonies operates a vast military fleet and requires constant replenishment and modernization. The Freestar Collective, with its ethos of individual self-determination, generates a steady and loyal market for the kind of reliable, versatile ship that a lone operator can stake their livelihood on. Traders, miners, explorers, bounty hunters, the full range of human occupation in a galaxy without roads. All of them need ships. The industry does not experience demand fluctuation in the way most industries do. It experiences demand as a constant, as gravity. And gravity, in the right circumstances, can be built upon. HopeTech identified a gap in how that demand was being served. The major manufacturers, many of them operating under significant regulatory and cost pressures within more densely populated systems, were producing vessels that trended toward either the high end of the luxury market or the military contract side of the spectrum. The middle range, the practical working ship built for durability and function rather than prestige or specialization, was underserved. HopeTech's founding vision was to fill that space, to build ships that simply worked, ships that were not beautiful in any particular way, but that kept working after years of hard use, after exposure to conditions that would strain more elegantly engineered vessels, after the accumulated abuse of operators who needed their ship to perform and could not afford for it not to. That vision came from a specific kind of experience. Ron Hope, the founder and president of HopeTech, did not build the company from a boardroom. He built it from the inside of a freighter cockpit. He came from working-class stock, spent years as a blue-collar deep space hauler, and knew from accumulated hours of interstellar cargo runs exactly what a reliable ship was worth to the person depending on it. He spent his life savings to establish HopeTech and the design philosophy that has defined every vessel the company has produced since traces directly back to that origin. Function over form, affordability over elegance, a ship that can haul vast amounts of cargo and be as trustworthy on its 300th flight as its first. The promise embedded in HopeTech's identity is not a marketing position. It is a translation of its founders' values into steel and grav drive. The decision to build on Polvo was inseparable from that vision, and it deserves to be understood clearly because it determines everything that comes after. Valo sits within the Freestar Collective sphere of influence. Freestar ships patrol the system's orbit, scanning incoming vessels. But the Collective's governing philosophy is deliberately light of hand, federated, libertarian, rooted in the principle that communities should govern themselves with minimal top-down interference. This creates a particular kind of freedom in practice, the freedom of whoever builds a settlement first to define its character without waiting for an external authority to approve it. Whoever builds the first permanent colony on a given world sets the terms. The rules they write are the rules that apply. The values they encode in their institutional structure are the values the place will operate under, at least until something else arrives with enough power to change them. Nothing else arrived. HopeTech wrote the rules, and the town that grew up around the shipyard became HopeTech's rules made physical, embodied in the layout of the streets, the terms of the leases, the hierarchy of who speaks to whom about what, and the unmistakable sense available to anyone who pauses long enough to feel it that every aspect of this settlement exists in service of a single industrial purpose. The planet also contributed something more material. The mineral deposits embedded in Polvo's rock formations are not glamorous, but they are consistent. They provide the kind of reliable supply chain that large-scale manufacturing depends on, the kind you cannot afford to interrupt mid-production cycle when a contract is waiting. There is a logic to all of this that is difficult to argue with. The site selection was not arbitrary. The infrastructure development was not improvised. This was a planned construction of a world in miniature, and it was built to function. The name itself is instructive. HopeTown. It is the kind of name that sounds optimistic until you spend enough time inside it to notice that the hope belongs to the company more than to the residents, or rather, that the town was named after the company, not after the aspiration. HopeTech's town, HopeTech's vision, HopeTech's investment, HopeTech's future made real in the form of buildings and roads and a landing pad capable of receiving the kinds of vessels the shipyard would produce. The branding is total, reaching down to the place name itself. You live in HopeTech's town. The address is a constant reminder of whose vision you are inhabiting. And at the center of that vision, Ron Hope himself. He manages both the company and the settlement personally, the single human being whose authority encompasses every meaningful decision made here. In the public presentation, this is framed as a virtue. HopeTech, the official company image, insists, treats its customers and employees like family. Ron Hope is the head of that family. The warmth is genuine on the surface. He presents as exactly what the HopeTech identity promises: a working-class man made good who builds ships for people who work for a living because he used to work for a living too. The narrative is compelling. It is also, as it turns out, only partially true. There is one more fact about Ron Hope's position that makes HopeTown's corporate governance something more than a regional peculiarity. He holds a seat on the Freestar Collective's Council of Governors, the governing body to which the Freestar Rangers themselves ultimately answer. The man who owns the company, runs the town, sets the rules, and employs the security force that enforces them, is also a formal participant in the collective's highest political structure. The line between corporate authority and governmental authority does not merely blur in HopeTown. At its apex, it has been formally dissolved by the same person who occupies both sides of it. The workforce that filled HopeTown in its early years was likely drawn from a specific and predictable population based on what we know of frontier settlement patterns across the settled systems. It is reasonable to assume the pull was strongest for people who had run out of other options, for whom the frontier was not an adventure but a last reasonable direction. Former UC citizens who had lost their status or their footing in the heavily stratified social system knew Atlantis, rewards, and punishes. Freestar Collective settlers who had tried to build independent operations and found the capital requirements of frontier survival exceeding what they could sustain. Independent ship crews whose vessels had been impounded, destroyed, or sold against debt. The galaxy is full of people who are between one life and the next, and HopeTech's standing offer, steady work, housing, a functioning community, had a genuine magnetic pull for those people. They came not because Polvo was their dream, but because HopeTech made the practical case better than any alternative available to them, which is, again, not nothing. The practical case was real. The stability was real. What they arrived into was real in every sense, including the senses that would take years to fully appreciate. What it was not built for, what was never part of the original design specification, was the full complexity of the human beings who would come to live inside it. Walk through HopeTown slowly and let the place describe itself. The shipyard is the first thing that registers, not because it is the most dramatic feature of the settlement visually, but because its presence organizes everything else. It occupies the functional center of HopeTown the way a cathedral occupies the center of a medieval town, not necessarily the geographic midpoint, but the point of orientation, the thing that everything else exists in relationship to. The residential areas cluster around it at distances that correspond roughly to employment status and rank. The housing for senior engineers and management sits closest to the administrative facilities, which are themselves attached to the production complex. Further out, the housing for general laborers and service workers occupies the margins of the planned settlement. The geography of the town is a map of the corporate hierarchy, legible to anyone who walks it with enough attention. What HopeTech provides its residents in material terms is genuine and should not be dismissed. The housing is functional and adequately maintained. People have climate control, running water, access to food supplies that the company either produces locally or imports under contracts it has negotiated. Medical care is available, not the kind you would find in a major UC facility on Jemison, but sufficient for the injuries and illnesses that routine industrial life produces, and available without the kind of bureaucratic resistance or financial gatekeeping that characterizes healthcare in settlements without institutional backing. Security is present, and, by frontier standards, remarkably consistent. The violence and instability that plague unaffiliated settlements, the pirate raids on poorly defended outposts, the resource conflicts between competing operations, the simple lawlessness of places that have no one with both the authority and the capacity to enforce order, is largely absent from HopeTown. The walls, metaphorical, and in some cases, literal, hold. For people who have lived in other frontier environments, who have experienced the casual brutality of an asteroid belt settlement, or the grinding precarity of an outpost that runs on hope and inadequate supply lines, HopeTown's stability has the quality of luxury. The everyday certainty that things will function, that the lights will work, that someone will respond to a medical emergency with genuine resources, that you can walk from one end of the settlement to the other without performing a continuous threat assessment, is not a small thing. In the broader context of human life in the settled systems, it represents a considerable achievement. HopeTech built it. HopeTech maintains it. And the people who live here are aware, most of them, that they are beneficiaries of that effort. The terms under which those benefits are received, though, contain architecture worth examining carefully. The housing that workers occupy is company-owned and company-leased. The commercial facilities inside the settlement operate under licensing arrangements administered by HopeTech's management structure. The medical services are company-administered. The security forces are company-employed. At every point where a resident might need to interact with an institutional structure, to pay rent, to seek medical attention, to report a crime, to access food, to resolve a dispute with a neighbor, the institution on the other side of that interaction is HopeTech. There is no public sector here in the sense that term carries in the UC. There is no independent judiciary. There is no institution that exists to represent the residents' interests in potential opposition to the companies, because in HopeTown there is no opposition. The company is the town. The town is the company. The economic consequence of this structure is subtle but consistent. Workers earn wages from HopeTech. They spend those wages in significant part on rent paid to HopeTech, on food purchased from HopeTech licensed vendors, on services provided through HopeTech's administrative apparatus. The money circulates, but it circulates within a closed system. It has an orbital quality, always finding its way back toward the central mass, always completing a loop that, with each revolution, leaves slightly more of it in corporate hands than it had at the start. This is not a scheme or a conspiracy. It is a design built into the structural logic of the place, and it is a design so elegant that it barely needs active enforcement. The logic of the settlement enforces it without anyone needing to make a conscious decision at each juncture. The governance structure is similarly self-sustaining. Ron Hope manages HopeTown directly, not through a layer of civic administration, but personally, as the president of the company that is also the government of the place. The security personnel are HopeTech employees, the people who make decisions about infrastructure maintenance, about which commercial operations are permitted to set up within the settlement's boundaries, about what constitutes a violation of community standards, and what the consequence of that violation will be. These are all HopeTech employees. Residents can raise concerns. They can speak to management. They can appeal up a chain of command that terminates not in a public office, but in the same desk at the top of the HopeTech tower where the company's business decisions are made. The formal channels of redress are real. They exist. Complaints are sometimes addressed. But they are entirely contained within the company's own structure. To challenge a decision made by the settlement's administration is to challenge your employer. To challenge your employer is to risk your housing, your income, your access to medical care, and your membership in the only community within viable distance of where you live. These are not hypothetical risks. They are the texture of daily calculation. This is what total corporate governance looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not obviously oppressive in the way that oppression is usually depicted, with an iron fist and a visible heel. More like a settled certainty, the quiet understanding available to anyone who thinks clearly enough and long enough that the ground beneath their feet has terms and conditions attached to it, and that the entity holding those terms is also the entity that determines what they mean and when they apply. In HopeTown, the alternative to engaging with HopeTech's ecosystem is not another ecosystem. It is the frontier's open hostility, the nearest viable settlement at a distance that makes casual alternatives impractical, and the knowledge that your housing and employment are both contingent on your continued presence as a compliant resident. The lack of a competing marketplace is not an oversight. It is a structural property of a world with only one institution. The people of HopeTown are not, in the main, naive about the nature of this arrangement. This is perhaps the most important and most frequently misunderstood fact about places like this. The residents understand where the power lies. They understand that HopeTech's interests and their own do not perfectly coincide, that the company's operational priorities were not written with individual human flourishing as the primary value. They understand that the stability they enjoy is contingent stability, that it depends on their continued utility to the corporate enterprise, and that a significant shift in HopeTech's operational needs could alter the terms of their lives in ways they would have no formal mechanism to resist. They know this, and they stay anyway. It is tempting to read that as resignation, as the defeated acceptance of people who have run out of alternatives and stopped imagining that any exist. For some residents, that description is probably accurate enough. The frontier is not generous with options. Relocating requires money, and money is exactly what the company town structure makes difficult to accumulate independently. Finding comparable work in a comparable environment requires connections and credentials that are hard to build when your professional identity has been shaped entirely within one company's ecosystem. For some people in HopeTown, the calculation is honest and bleak. This is what there is. The choice to stay is not a choice between options. It is the recognition that there is effectively one option and it is here. But the picture is not uniformly that dark, and pretending it is would be both inaccurate and condescending to the people who live here. There are workers in HopeTown's shipyard who take genuine, justifiable pride in what they produce. Building ships is consequential work in the most literal possible sense. Vessels assembled in this yard travel throughout the settled systems, carrying people, goods, and the essential materials of civilization to places that would go without them otherwise. The craftspeople and engineers who do that work are not interchangeable. Their knowledge is specialized and hard-won. It takes years to develop the competence that allows someone to work on a starship's systems with the confidence that their work will hold together under the pressures of interstellar travel, and the people who possess that competence know its value. They are not simply laborers, they are practitioners of a skilled and serious trade, and their relationship to that trade is not reducible to their relationship to their employer. HopeTech's ships, moreover, carry a specific reputation throughout the settled systems that the workers here can claim as genuinely their own: functional, durable, reliable under conditions that would stress more refined construction. Not beautiful, nobody pretends they are, but trustworthy in a way that matters more than beauty to the people who depend on them for their livelihoods or their lives. That reputation was built by the hands working in this settlement. It was built over years of disciplined, exacting production, and it belongs to the workers as much as it belongs to the company, even if the company holds the trademark and the profits. The people of HopeTown built something they can point to with pride, and the fact that HopeTech extracts most of the economic value of that achievement does not entirely extinguish the meaning available in the achievement itself. So, the social contract of HopeTown contains more texture than the political critique alone can capture. It includes real dependency, yes, structural coercion built into the architecture of a world where one entity controls all the essential resources. But it also includes genuine exchange, stability in return for acquiescence, purpose in return for autonomy, community in return for independence. What makes this arrangement particularly durable, particularly resistant to straightforward critique, is that the exchange offers genuine value on both sides. The residents are not simply victims of a system that gives them nothing. They are participants in an arrangement that gives them things they actually want, at a cost that has been carefully structured to remain just below the threshold of intolerability. The ships themselves carry this duality out into the galaxy. Every HopeTech vessel that leaves this yard carries, invisibly embedded in its construction, the specific competence and care of the people who built it, people who lived in housing they did not own, worked under governance they did not choose, and who nonetheless chose to do the work well. The vessel simply holds together under stress. It keeps flying after years of hard service. It brings people home when other ships would have failed. The human cost embedded in its construction is invisible from the outside. What is visible is only the result, something made well by people whose full circumstances most of its operators will never think to ask about. The cost is not evenly distributed, and it tends to compound in ways that take years to become fully visible. One imagines, and the structure of the place makes this inference difficult to avoid, that living somewhere every institutional interaction is filtered through corporate interest produces a particular kind of diminishment over time, not of material well-being necessarily, but of the sense that one is a full civic agent in the world. The habit of self-censorship that develops in environments where dissent carries professional consequence. The internalized awareness of which opinions are safe to hold publicly and which should be kept private, which concerns can be raised through the approved channels, and which will simply earn you a reputation as a difficult person. The slow narrowing of political imagination that occurs when you have spent years in a place that has only one political actor, one source of authority, one frame through which decisions about collective life are made. These are not dramatic losses. They do not show up in safety statistics or quality of life metrics, but based on what we know about the psychology of closed institutional environments, they accumulate in the texture of daily experience, in the slight but persistent difference between a community where people feel genuinely free to say what they think, and one where they have learned over time to calibrate carefully. The places where the system shows its strain do not always announce themselves in advance. Sometimes the fracture arrives not from below, not from workers reaching their limit, but from above, from the person at the center of the entire arrangement making a decision that reveals what the corporate governance model actually is when the profit motive stops being served by the benevolent version of itself. To understand this, you need to understand the financial pressure that was building inside HopeTech in the years before 2330. The company had been suffering a series of consecutive quarterly financial losses as recently as 2328, losses significant enough that industry observers across the settled systems were openly predicting imminent insolvency. The company that Ron Hope had built from his life savings, the one he had used to construct an entire settlement and earn himself a seat at the collective's most powerful table, was facing the real possibility of collapse. The version of events in which HopeTech is simply a stable, well-run enterprise that happens to also govern a town glosses over this period entirely. But it matters, because what came next was not the action of a company operating confidently within its stated values. It was the action of a man under pressure who had already decided, somewhere along the way, that the rules that applied to other people did not apply to him. Ron Hope moved to diversify HopeTech's portfolio. He developed an experimental fertilizer and advertised it to Freestar settlers, farmers on worlds like Montara Luna, who were trying to build something independently, outside the corporate settlement model, on land they owned and worked themselves. What the farmers did not know, and what HopeTech scientists had discovered, was that the fertilizer was disastrous for crops. It killed them. But it had an unexpected secondary effect. It catalyzed mineral formation in the soil, hardening it and enriching it with several valuable resources, the kind of resources that could feed HopeTech's ship manufacturing operation and reduce its reliance on external supply chains. Ron Hope knew this. He continued selling the fertilizer anyway. He waited for the farms to fail, and when the farmers' operations collapsed under them, he hired a mercenary company called the First to apply pressure, to make it clear to people who had already lost their crops that staying on their land was no longer an option they could afford to hold. The first were not a neutral security firm. They were a group with a specific grudge against the Freestar Collective, which gave them motivation beyond the paycheck. HopeTech provided them with resources. The farmers who had trusted HopeTech's product were pushed off their own land so that HopeTech could mine the minerals that HopeTech's own product had put there. This is what the fracture in HopeTown's system looks like when the full picture comes into focus, not the quiet internal friction of workers who have noticed the structural terms, not the slow exit of people who have reached the limits of their accommodation. The fracture at the top was this: a man who had built his identity around the image of a working-class entrepreneur who treated everyone like family had been in the time when the family narrative was most useful to him, poisoning the land of independent farmers and hiring mercenaries to do what the poison started. The paternalism was real. The ruthlessness beneath it was also real. The two things coexisted, and this is perhaps the most instructive thing HopeTown has to teach: that the most dangerous version of corporate power is not the kind that is openly predatory, but the kind that is genuinely warm, right up until the point where warmth stops serving the balance sheet. Individual resistance in a company town takes forms that are deliberately small, because small is survivable. A worker who does the minimum required rather than the discretionary extra that distinguishes merely functional output from genuinely excellent work. A family that maintains active connections to people and places outside HopeTech's sphere, refusing the complete social enclosure that the company town's design implicitly encourages. A supervisor who bends a minor rule in a worker's favor when they could just as easily enforce it, not because the rule is wrong, but because the small exercise of human judgment over bureaucratic procedure represents the only available assertion of moral agency within the structure. These gestures are nearly invisible. They do not threaten the architecture of the arrangement, but they testify to the fact that the people inside the structure have not entirely become the structure. The cost of more visible dissent is significant, and its shape is specific to the company town form. In a city with an independent government, in New Atlantis, for instance, or Aquila City, you can criticize the administration without risking your housing. You can organize with co-workers without threatening your access to medical care. You can speak to a journalist, a lawyer, an elected representative, a regulatory body, someone whose professional existence does not depend on the goodwill of the entity you are criticizing. The infrastructure of legitimate challenge exists outside and independent of the power being challenged. It is precisely this infrastructure that a corporate town cannot permit, because the existence of any institution with authority independent of the company is a structural threat to the entire governance model. The absence of independent institutional alternatives in HopeTown is not an oversight or an administrative gap. It is the condition of the arrangement's possibility. What this produces is a particular quality of exit rather than voice. The people who reach the limits of their accommodation, who find that the calculation no longer balances in their favor, that the cost of staying has exceeded the value of what staying provides, tend to leave quietly, not with declarations or visible conflict, but with the gradual divestment of emotional investment, the slow accumulation of resources toward departure, and eventually the departure itself, undertaken without fanfare in a community that has learned not to attend too closely to these moments because too much attention raises questions that are inconvenient for everyone. The settlement processes these departures as routine workforce turnover. The company accounts for them in resource planning. The community absorbs them with the practiced continuity of a place that has seen this happen many times before and expects to see it many times again. What replaces the people who leave, typically, are people who are new to HopeTown and have not yet completed the full education that living there provides. People who arrived for the stability and the work and have not yet felt the entire weight of the structural terms. The settlement replenishes itself on this cycle, not through any cynical mechanism of deliberate manipulation, but through the simple logic of a system that functions most smoothly when there is always a sufficient supply of people who have not yet reached the point where the costs become visible enough to act on. Some will reach that point and leave. Others will reach it and find a personal accommodation, a way of living with the awareness that does not require acting on it. The cycle continues regardless. The shipyard produces ships. The town produces labor for the shipyard. Polvo's wind goes on shaping everything, slowly and without particular regard for the human arrangements it moves through. There is a particular kind of person worth pausing on who does neither, who reaches full awareness of the structural arrangement, holds it clearly, and continues to live in HopeTown with the quiet, complicated dignity of someone who has made a genuinely difficult peace. These people are not rare. They are, in some ways, the most significant population in the settlement, the ones who have been here long enough to know everything and who have found a way to remain fully human inside a constrained world. They know which rules can be bent and which cannot. They hold the institutional memory of HopeTown's human life, the stories that do not appear in HopeTech's records, the history that exists in the gap between the company's official account of itself and the actual experience of living here. They are the archive inside the archive. The value of HopeTown as a lens lies not in what makes it exceptional, but in what makes it continuous with the broader landscape of the settled systems. Pull back to a sufficient distance and a pattern emerges that the individual settlement obscures. Rujin Industries, operating from the platform city of Neon on Voli Alpha, does not run a company town in the strict formal sense, but its relationship to Neon is deeply analogous in structure. The city was built on a corporate asset, an aquatic platform originally designed for fish extraction that discovered a more profitable yield in processed pharmaceutical compounds. And the economic and cultural life of Neon has never fully detached from that origin. Rujin's interests and Neon's future are so thoroughly entangled that the question of which one governs the other is almost semantic. The company shapes the city. The city houses the company. The distinction between corporate strategy and urban policy, examined closely enough, becomes difficult to locate in practice. The United Colonies presents a deliberately different model, one that has invested heavily in the apparatus of institutional independence, in a legal system with formal structure and genuine enforcement capacity, in a military and a bureaucracy that, for all their considerable flaws, nominally serve a public interest rather than a private one. The UC's governance structure is real and meaningfully distinct from what HopeTown offers. The mast, New Atlantis's administrative center, represents something HopeTown has no equivalent of: a concentration of institutional power that is, at least in principle, accountable to the population it governs through mechanisms that exist independently of economic relationship. The UC's citizenship structure, with all its demands and all its offers, is built on the premise that the relationship between the individual and the state is not purely economic, that there are rights and obligations that exist outside the employment contract. But even within the UC, the relationship between major industrial interests and institutional decision-making is not one of clean separation. The corporations that build the UC's ships, supply its military, extract its resources, and provide the commercial infrastructure of its cities are not passive subjects of regulation. They are participants in the regulatory process. They employ the people who sometimes become the regulators. They fund the political conditions that produce the administrators who write the rules. The independence of UC institutions from corporate influence is real, but it is not absolute, and the political history of the settled systems contains enough examples of that independence being quietly negotiated in rooms where the conversation is not recorded, to make the distance between UC governance and HopeTech's governance a matter of degree as much as kind. The Freestar Collective offers the philosophical alternative, the articulation of an entirely different foundational value, that what matters above all is individual liberty, the right of people to organize their own lives without the imposition of centralized authority, whether that authority wears a government uniform or a corporate logo. The Rangers embody this ideal with genuine conviction, and the Collective's founding mythology, the story of people who chose the hard freedom of the frontier over the comfortable order of the UC, represents a real historical choice made by real people who valued something enough to pay a significant price for it. That tradition is not hollow. But Ron Hope's story is perhaps the sharpest possible illustration of where that tradition runs out. He does not exist outside the Freestar Collective system. He sits inside it, at its highest table. His seat on the Council of Governors, the body to which the Freestar Rangers themselves ultimately answer, means that the accountability structure of the collective, the mechanism that is supposed to hold power responsible, had a corporate town owner as one of its voting members. The Rangers who investigated the fertilizer scheme and the first's activities on Montara Luna were, in a formal institutional sense, working for the governing body that contained the man they were investigating. That is not a flaw in the collective's design that was later patched. It is a structural property of a system that welcomes people who build things and gives them political power proportional to what they have built, without requiring them to separate that power from the economic interests they bring with them. The collective's own history complicates the purity of its founding mythology further. The freedom the collective celebrates was, from its inception, the freedom of people who could afford the journey to its worlds, who arrived with sufficient resources to build something worth having self-determination over. The self-determination it enshrines was never uniformly distributed. On the edges of collective territory, in the settlements that exist beyond the reach of Aquila City's institutions, in the places where HopeTech's model of corporate settlement is most directly comparable to the collective's ideal. The difference between living under a company's rules and living under the freedom the collective promises is not always distinguishable in practice. Freedom without institutional support is often just another form of precarity. And precarity, as HopeTown demonstrates with quiet consistency, is one of the most reliable conditions for the emergence of exactly the kind of corporate authority that frontier liberty was supposed to render unnecessary. What all three models share is an incompleteness in the face of scale. The galaxy continues to expand in every direction that human ambition points. Civilization is always arriving somewhere for the first time, always planting itself on a new world and asking what governance will look like here. The honest answer, more often than not, is not a charter or an election or a council of representatives. The honest answer is whoever got here first with sufficient capital to make the place functional, which means the answer is usually a company. The question, who governs here, gets answered the way it has been answered throughout all of human history, adjusted for the medium of interstellar space. Whoever holds the deed holds the power, and the power becomes governance, and governance over time becomes the natural order of things, and the natural order of things eventually stops needing to be justified because it simply is what things are. There is a harder truth lurking beneath this. The alternative to corporate settlement on the frontier is often not representative democracy. It is instability. It is the kind of vacuum that groups like the First, a mercenary company with a specific grievance against the Freestar Collective itself, willing to take any contract that paid well enough, are available to fill. Violence as a service to whoever controls the contract, firepower where institutions are absent because firepower is faster and cheaper to deploy. The settled systems has learned through experience that costed considerably that ungoverned space does not stay ungoverned for long. Something always moves in. HopeTech's version of what moves in, productive, structured, at least nominally oriented toward building something rather than simply extracting from it, is not the worst available option. This is not an argument in HopeTech's favor, so much as it is an acknowledgement of the landscape within which the choice is made. The alternatives are real, and some of them are worse. The people of HopeTown live in a system designed around corporate priority. The people of an ungoverned settlement near a contested resource deposit often do not live at all. This is the calculus the settled systems has never found a satisfying way to escape. HopeTown is that answer made visible, stripped of the civic theater that tends to surround it elsewhere, standing in plain view on a wind-carved planet and asking anyone curious enough to look what exactly they thought governance was in the first place. Return to HopeTown one final time, not to catalog it or argue about it, but to stand in it for a moment, to be present there as something more than a political observer. Feel the persistent quality of the wind coming off the rocky ground, constant and unhurried, the signature background of this particular corner of the galaxy. Hear the low industrial register of the shipyard at full operation, a sound so constant that long-term residents stopped experiencing it as intrusive years ago. It has become the baseline, the thing underneath all other sounds, the evidence that the place is alive and working. Notice the quality of light on Polvo, softened at certain hours, giving the settlement a slightly diffuse quality, as though even the architecture is rendered a little uncertain of its own edges. In that light, the details that are not HopeTech's achievement come into focus. A mural on the side of a maintenance building near the residential quarter, painted by someone with genuine skill and a need to make something that was not a component for a starship. A small garden maintained in the corner of an open space between two housing blocks, planted and tended by residents who wanted something green and growing in an environment that neither requires nor encourages it, who gave it their attention with a regularity that says something irreducible about what people do when they need to be responsible for something that belongs to them rather than to the company. The sound of a gathering inside a building as you pass, laughter, and the warm, blurred register of people who know each other well, for whom this particular collection of other human beings represents home in the most basic and unkillable sense of the word. These details are not incidental. They are the evidence of something that the corporate governance framework cannot fully account for and cannot entirely contain. The insistence of human beings on being completely human inside structures that were not designed with that as a priority. HopeTown was built to produce ships. The people of HopeTown have been producing, alongside the ships, a life that exceeds the original specification. They did not ask permission for this. They simply did it, with the persistent creativity that emerges whenever people find even the smallest gap in a total structure and discover that the gap is large enough to grow something inside. This does not resolve the political critique. The warmth of a community gathering does not dissolve the reality of a lease held by the same entity that employs everyone at that gathering. The beauty of a painted mural does not render the governance structure benign. What it does is make the question more honest, more genuinely complicated than the simple narrative of corporate oppression can contain. Because if HopeTown were only a grim place of suppressed workers and cynical management, the lesson would be easy and the analysis would be shallow. The fact that it is not, that real lives are lived here with real meaning and real attachment, that people have built something genuinely worth valuing inside a structure that was never designed for their full flourishing, is precisely what makes the arrangement so durable and so resistant to simple opposition. The most stable forms of power are the ones that provide genuine value, not the forms that rest primarily on threat or visible coercion, but the forms that make themselves difficult to refuse because refusing them would cost you something you actually want. HopeTech arrived at this, whether through deliberate strategy or the accumulated pragmatism of people who needed something to work and kept building until it did. The company created a model of authority that sustains itself with minimal, visible friction, that generates alongside its industrial output something that looks enough like community to function as community for most residents most of the time, and that extracts, in return, not just labor, but the form of civic participation that, in other contexts, would be considered a right. The question asked at the beginning of this, whether the people of HopeTown can still tell the difference between being citizens and being employees, whether those two things mean anything different in a place where one entity provides both the work and the world. does not resolve into a single, clean answer. Some residents hold the distinction clearly and carry the awareness of what it costs with the quiet steadiness of people who have made a choice they understand. Others have let the distinction blur, not through ignorance, but through the practical intelligence of people who have found genuine meaning in a specific context and see no benefit in the philosophical destabilization that maintaining full clarity would require. Both responses are rational. Both are deeply human. Both exist simultaneously in the same settlement, sometimes in the same person at different moments. What they share is the weight of a question that the settled systems has not yet found the will to ask at scale. What is the difference between a government and a company when the company is all there is? As the frontier continues to expand, as new worlds receive their first permanent settlements, as the question of authority gets answered for the first time again and again on planets that no existing polity has yet claimed, the answer that keeps forming is the same one standing quietly on Polvo, made of dust and industrial purpose, and the stubborn, unkillable desire of people to make a life out of whatever they have been given to work with. HopeTown is not a warning, exactly. It is a mirror. Ron Hope, a man who came from nothing, built something real, positioned himself as the patriarch of a family that included everyone who depended on him, and then used the full weight of that position to harm the people outside its walls when his balance sheet required it, is the reflection that mirror offers most clearly. The question is whether anyone in the UC's gleaming corridors, in Aquila City's council chambers, aboard any ship built in this very yard, will look into it long enough to see what it is actually showing them, and whether, by the time they do, there will still be enough distance between what is and what could be to make any of it matter. That is what the archive holds. That is what Polvo is keeping in its patient dust-filtered light for anyone willing to read it carefully. The stars remember everything, which means perhaps that we do not have to. But some things are worth the effort of remembering before the distance between what we built and what we intended closes entirely.